The cool Montana spring air swept across the dusty train yard as a line of Japanese prisoners of war stepped cautiously onto the platform. Their uniforms were torn, their bodies thin, their eyes full of fear. They had crossed an ocean in chains, convinced that what awaited them in America would be worse than the battlefield they had left behind. They had been told that Americans were brutal, that they would be starved, tortured, maybe even executed for sport. To surrender was dishonor in the Japanese code. To fall into enemy hands was worse than death. Many of these men had expected to be beaten the moment they arrived. But what greeted them instead was something so strange, so utterly unthinkable that many thought at first it must be a cruel trick. A tall cowboy with a sunburned face and a broad hat strolled casually along the line. He was not shouting orders or pointing a rifle. Instead, he was smiling. In his hand, he carried a crate of glass bottles glistening with condensation. He stopped in front of the first prisoner, tipped the brim of his hat, and held out a bottle. "Dr. Pepper," the cowboy asked. The Japanese prisoner stared, frozen, unable to comprehend. A drink, cold, sweet liquid in the middle of the Montana plains. For a moment he did not move, convinced it must be poisoned. Then cautiously he reached out. The bottle was cold in his hand, condensation dripping down the glass. When he took a sip, the sharp fizz exploded on his tongue like nothing he had ever tasted before. Around him, the other prisoners watched in disbelief as cowboys began passing bottles down the line. Some of the POWs laughed nervously. Others shook their heads, too suspicious to drink. But the Americans just kept smiling, offering more. Then came another shock. A guard opened a canvas bag and began tossing wide-brimmed cowboy hats toward the prisoners. One landed at the feet of a young Japanese naval officer who bent slowly to pick it up. He stared at it as though it were a relic from another planet. Finally, almost in a daze, he placed it on his head. The sight of a captured Japanese officer wearing a cowboy hat drew chuckles from the guards. But it was not mockery. It was amusement, even camaraderie. For men who had braced themselves for cruelty, this moment felt impossible. They had stepped off the train expecting pain and humiliation. Instead, they were drinking ice-cold Dr. Pepper and trying on cowboy hats in the Montana spring air. It was the first sign that everything they thought they knew about America was wrong. For the Japanese soldiers who stepped onto Montana soil in 1944, nothing could have been more disorienting than kindness. Their entire culture had taught them to expect the opposite. Since the beginning of the Pacific War, Japanese military doctrine drilled one lesson into every man. Capture meant shame. Surrender meant dishonor. The Bushido code, inherited from the samurai, was clear. Death was preferable to captivity. A soldier who allowed himself to be taken prisoner brought disgrace not only upon himself, but upon his ancestors and his family. That belief had been reinforced by propaganda. Japanese newspapers and radio broadcasts insisted that Americans were barbarians, a nation of soft consumers who would show no mercy to enemies. Prisoners, they were told, would be tortured for amusement, executed without dignity. By 1943, America faced an unusual problem. The nation's war machine was producing at a scale unprecedented in history. But manpower was stretched thin. Millions of young American men were overseas fighting in Europe and the Pacific. At home, factories ran day and night. Farms needed workers. And the cattle ranches of Montana faced a crisis. Who would herd the cattle, mend the fences, and keep the beef flowing to feed both civilians and soldiers abroad? The answer came from an unexpected source: German and Japanese prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention allowed capture nations to put prisoners to work so long as the labor was not dangerous and did not directly support combat operations. For America, this became a perfect solution. Instead of letting thousands of captured enemy soldiers sit idle in guarded compounds, the U.S. military shipped them inland far from the coast to work in industries desperate for labor. Montana, with its sprawling cattle ranches and strong tradition of ranching culture, became a prime location. By the end of the war, more than 45,000 Axis POWs mostly Germans, but also Japanese, were held in camps scattered across the state. Many were assigned to work the land. To the locals, this was a strange sight. Cowboys in broad hats and dusty boots rode alongside prisoners who only months before had been fighting under the rising sun. Instead of bayonets and bullets, the men now shared lassos, branding irons, and herding dogs. The shock for the Japanese prisoners was profound. They had expected barbed wire, starvation, and brutality. What they found instead was open sky, wide fields, and the rhythm of cattle ranch life. A Montana ranch was not a luxury resort, but compared to the war-ravaged islands of the Pacific or the hungry streets of Tokyo, it was abundance. The daily routine began at dawn. Prisoners escorted by guards who often carried rifles slung casually over their shoulders were assigned to mend fences, drive herds, or repair ranch equipment. The work was backbreaking at times, but it was familiar in a way. Physical labor, honest and visible in its results. What truly shocked the prisoners, however, was the food. American ranches had meat in quantities that defied imagination. Beef, potatoes, corn, and fresh bread were served in camp mess halls. Dr. Pepper and coffee were common. Sometimes after long days in the sun, guards shared ice cream, a treat many Japanese men had never even seen before. And then there were the cowboy hats. For the Americans, it was partly humor and partly hospitality. Some ranchers thought it funny to see their former enemies wearing the wide-brimmed hats of Montana. Others believed it was a way to break down barriers, to show that these men were no longer warriors, but workers sharing in the life of the ranch. For the prisoners, it was bewildering. To wear a cowboy hat was to wear a symbol of freedom and independence, the exact opposite of captivity. Yet over time, many PWs wore them proudly, as if absorbing a small piece of the frontier spirit. The irony was staggering. In Japan, propaganda had portrayed America as decadent, weak, and corrupt. But in Montana, even captivity felt richer, freer, and more humane than the daily life many remembered back home. The PWs were learning a lesson their commanders had never prepared them for. America's greatest strength was not cruelty, but abundance. It was not terror, but efficiency. And it was not ideology, but confidence in a way of life so secure that even prisoners could taste its fruits. By the time the war ended, many Japanese PWs would look back on these ranches not as cages of shame, but as strange, unexpected classrooms where cowboy hats and Dr. Pepper taught them lessons about the modern world. Numbers often speak louder than memories, and the statistics of wartime America are what stunned Japanese prisoners most. They had grown up in an empire of scarcity, where every resource was measured and rationed. On the cattle ranches of Montana, they were suddenly confronted with the math of excess. Start with the numbers of prisoners themselves. By 1945, America was holding more than 400,000 Axis PWs within its borders. Montana alone housed around 45,000 of them, spread across dozens of camps. Some of these men were Germans captured in North Africa, but a significant number were Japanese, plucked from Pacific battlefields and transported across oceans to the quiet heart of the American frontier. Now look at the scale of the cattle industry. Montana had more than 3.8 million head of cattle grazing across its plains in the 1940s. The war had created a booming demand for beef, not just for American civilians, but for soldiers overseas, Allied armies, and even prisoner camps. Then came the food math. In wartime Japan, a soldier might survive on scarcely 750 calories a day, often less when supply lines collapsed. Rice was rationed, meat was almost non-existent, and sugar had become a rare luxury. By contrast, a PWs in Montana was allocated roughly 3,400 calories daily, in line with U.S. Army standards. That meant double the fuel for the body. Protein from beef, carbohydrates from bread and potatoes, and fat from butter, milk, and oils. It is no wonder that many prisoners gained weight in captivity. Some wrote in memoirs that they ate better behind barbed wire in Montana than they had as free men in Japan. The irony was devastating. The enemy fed them better than their emperor ever could. And then there was Dr. Pepper, the ultimate symbol of American abundance. By 1943, the company had pledged to make sure every U.S. soldier could buy a soda for 5 cents anywhere in the world. This meant bottling plants were set up not just in American cities, but in North Africa, Australia, and the Pacific Islands. More than 4.8 billion bottles of Dr. Pepper were produced during the war. 4 Japanese POWs, who had never seen anything like it, the casual availability of a sweet, fizzy drink felt almost supernatural. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto had been captured in the summer of 1944 after his transport vessel was intercepted near Saipan. He expected nothing less than death, at best, torture and starvation. So when his train rolled into a small Montana town and he saw cowboys leaning casually against fences, chewing on stalks of hay, he thought it was all theater, a cruel trick before execution. Instead, he found himself assigned to a cattle ranch outside Billings. The ranch owner, a wiry man named Bill Henderson, sized him up not as an enemy, but as another pair of hands. "You can work?" Henderson asked through a translator. Yamamoto nodded stiffly. That was the beginning of his education in cowboy life. His first job was mucking stalls, shoveling manure alongside German POWs already at the ranch. The Germans moved with practiced ease, joking with guards in broken English. Yamamoto worked silently, bracing for abuse. But when he slipped and dropped his shovel, Henderson didn't strike him. Instead, he chuckled and handed him another. "Happens to all of us," the cowboy said. For Yamamoto, the moment was disorienting. Mercy was not weakness here. It was normal. Days turned into weeks. Yamamoto learned to saddle horses, mend fences, and drive cattle. The cowboys showed him rope knots and saddle techniques with patience that left him unsettled. In Japan, correction often came with shouting or blows. Here, it came with demonstration and calm repetition. It was not the way of warlords, but it worked. The food shocked him even more. Lunch breaks meant beef stew, cornbread, and sometimes Dr. Pepper from glass bottles chilled in a stream. Yamamoto's first sip of the sweet, fizzy drink nearly made him cough. He had never tasted anything like it. The German POWs laughed at his reaction, slapping him on the back. Soon he was drinking alongside them, the bitterness of defeat dissolving into shared astonishment at America's abundance. One Saturday evening, the ranch hands threw a barbecue for the POWs' laborers. Henderson insisted that everyone eat together, Americans, Germans, and Japanese alike. Yamamoto sat stiffly at first, watching cowboys flip steaks over open flames. The smell was intoxicating, rich, and heavy. When a plate was thrust into his hands, he hesitated. Then hunger overcame hesitation. The meat was tender, dripping with juices, seasoned in a way he had never known. He realized with a jolt that he was eating better as a prisoner than he had as an officer in the Imperial Navy. Perhaps the most surreal moment came weeks later when Henderson handed him a wide-brimmed cowboy hat. "Keeps the sun off," the rancher said simply. Yamamoto froze. To accept felt like a betrayal of his heritage, his emperor, his Bushido code, but the heat was unbearable. Slowly he took it and placed it on his head. The Germans cheered. The cowboys grinned, and for the first time, Yamamoto laughed. It was not the laugh of mockery or arrogance, but of disbelief that the enemy had given him shade and dignity. At night, lying in the wooden bunk of his barracks, he replayed the days in his mind. Back home, his family was likely surviving on scraps, hiding in bomb shelters. Here he was eating steak, learning ranch work, and drinking a beverage that seemed endless in supply. The contradictions gnawed at him. Could Japan truly win against a country that treated prisoners this way while still supplying its own people and armies across oceans? Years later, after the war, Yamamoto recounted his Montana days to his children. He kept the cowboy hat worn and sun-bleached as proof of what he had lived. That hat, he told them, taught me that America's strength was not only in weapons, but in its abundance, its confidence, and its strange kindness. It broke the lies I had believed. For Yamamoto, the ranch in Montana was not captivity. It was revelation. The story of Japanese POWs in Montana is not just a footnote to World War II. It is a reminder that wars are fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with ideas, food, culture, and even kindness. These men arrived expecting brutality and left carrying cowboy hats, Dr. Pepper bottles, and a memory of abundance that would reshape their view of the world. For America, it proved something greater than battlefield victories. It proved that the nation's industrial might, cultural confidence, and sheer capacity for generosity were as decisive as any weapon. Because in the end, America didn't just win the war with weapons. It won with Dr. Pepper and cowboys.